Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning. My name is Joe Sellepack. I'm the Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches. We are in a very interesting time period in the life of our nation. We have protests going on and Black Lives Matter campaigns going on around our country. There are drafted statements being offered by the National Council of Churches. Almost every denomination has a statement against racism. These times remind me a lot of what our country went through back in the Civil Rights era. And I have a friend of mine, his name is Clyde Fant. Clyde Fant wrote a book entitled The World in Black and White. Clyde is the Reverend Dr. Clyde Fant. He was chaplain for the university at Stetson. He also served as a homiletics professor. He's written several books. One of my favorite books that he translated was Worldly Preaching by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But the book we want to talk a little bit about today is a memoir that Clyde wrote entitled The World in Black and White. Let's welcome Clyde to Encounter. Welcome to Encounter, Clyde.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
It's good to see you too. And we've been, I was thinking about this. You and I have been friends for over 20 years now. It's hard to believe that. But it was about 20 years ago that you took a young seminarian or a seminary graduate, and I've been a minister now for 25 years, but about 5 years after I started ministry, you started corresponding with me, and I would send you some tapes, and you would listen to my sermons, and then you would send me criticism back. It was a wonderful experience, and I know I've thanked you before for that, but I just want to reiterate that thanks, because I am very grateful for the work you put into me. But you were at one time a young seminarian too, and some of the experiences that you write in this book, it's called The World in Black and White, are a reflection on growing up in the South, as well as your journey in ministry too. So you want to talk a little bit about the title first, and then we can go into some of your experiences in the book.
Yes, I grew up in a black and white world. I was born in 1934, one of the worst years of the Great Depression, and everything was settled, especially in the South where I was. Blacks were blacks and whites were whites, and never the twain shall meet, much less mix, intermarry, or any of that heretical stuff. And everything was settled as far as ethics and morality, and dads worked, moms stayed at home. 10 Commandments were the 10 Commandments. They could be written and posted anywhere. Confederate statues were everywhere. We were glad to have them. It was black and white. And the movies were all in black and white. Only 10% of the movies, 1945, were in color. So that was my world, all settled.
And what was interesting throughout the book, one of the things that you keep pointing out to was how, one of the perceptions was that the world was in black and white, but in some ways, the world itself was more gray than what it let itself think it was. So there was more gray in your life than that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. There are areas where it just didn't make sense to me. We had a maid, and my grandmother had a maid that was very close to me as a child. And when my grandmother died, who was closest, well, my mom was close, my father was always a little distant, but when my grandmother died, that maid was invited by the family to sit with them. And I loved her. We all loved her. But I couldn't understand why it was that all the blacks we knew individually were very close. But the blacks as a group were supposed to stay in their place. I never could put that together.
And one of the experiences that you talk about right at the beginning of the book, like the first chapter, is about a cross burning that happened next door, and then you kind of extrapolate from that the kind of like, you know, the journey that you took to get to that place, and how you the events that may have changed how you even perceive the cross burning. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Do you feel comfortable doing that?
Sure. Would you like me to talk about any of the events at the small church, Belcher, or you want me to just tell you about the burning of the cross and that?
Well, you could do whatever you feel like, Clyde. I mean, I trust you, man.
That may be unwise, but
It is true.
Yeah, I tell you, I had some early experiences. My first church was in a tiny cotton growing, well, a big cotton growing area, but a tiny village. And I had some encounters that were pretty rough, but it gave me a little heads up about what I was about to go into. From that church, I was called to the First Baptist Church in Ruston, Louisiana, which is where Louisiana Tech is located. And it's a fine church, a very progressive church for its time. But I woke up with a cross burning next door. I couldn't imagine it. I sat with my neighbor in the dark under his mimosa tree. He had a rifle across his lap, and an automobile circled continuously through the neighborhood with its lights off. My neighbor had tried to call the police. Nobody had come. The mayor had just been elected. As a matter of fact, about the same time I went to the church, a couple of months earlier. I was brand new. I mean, you can't be any fresher than 2 months on the field and still learning names. But I knew the mayor was in our church. So finally, anger overcame my fear, and I went to the phone. I called the mayor, and I told him that I wanted him to get some. No, I told him I expected him to get some police out there in a hurry.
Yeah.
And within a few minutes, two surly, burly policemen showed up, very unhappy, towed the smoldering remnants of the cross and muttered a bit, and weren't happy about having to be there. But after I went back home and went to bed, my neighbor decided he thought he had an idea who might be involved with it. So he went to the home of a man. Sure enough, there was this dull white sedan in his carport, and my neighbor was pretty shrewd. He reached down and felt the tailpipe, which was still hot, and he banged on the door and demanded the man had come to the door. The man's wife came, and finally the man did come, and they had a confrontation. The man denied he had even been out of the house that night, and my neighbor asked him, why was the tailpipe of your car hot here at 2 a.m. in the morning? But trouble came from all that business, and my experience there gave me a perspective about the kind of world I was in and the years ahead.
Now, from that experience, like you talk about that in the first chapter, then you go back into your history and you talk about how you got to that point.
Yeah.
So you talk about growing up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and I thought that was your father being the mayor of Shreveport, kind of and your history at church and attending church and the rest of that. How did all of that kind of come together into leading you to where you began to look at the world in a more gray way?
Yeah. My father was a very powerful politician in the state of Louisiana. He was probably, or I would say unquestionably, the strongest non-long politician in the state.
Yeah.
From
You
Huey.
gotta say that Huey Long was one of the biggest politicians of the time, right?
Yeah, Huey was probably in danger. We were in danger of having Huey run for president. He'd become very, very popular. Louisiana doesn't want to admit it now, but they had the largest welfare program in the nation.
Right.
And the blacks were, all the old people were prime recipients. It used to be so here in Florida, where I am, so much so that the senator here was called Senator Old Folks, but that's not the case now.
Right.
Smallest unemployment payments probably in the nation, or second smallest, are in this state. But anyway, my dad, he was a good man. He was a segregationist for sure. He really believed in separate but equal. It's not right, I think, but he did build libraries even, and he did build swimming pools, and he did benefit the black churches, and the ministers were very fond of him, and he carried the sections of town overwhelmingly where the blacks and poor people predominantly lived. I didn't understand that very well, and I went in doing research for this book, and I was with one of those pastors. And he said, well, get in the car. I want to show you something. And he drove past where his church had built facilities for the aged and poor. He said, you see that land? I said, yes. He said, your father made it possible for the city to donate that land to us. It wasn't being used for anything. Your father very cleverly had the city council decide that only blacks would be able to use it because it was down in the bottoms where nobody else was going to live anyway. And so we were able to get it. The first year, he said, that I was a pastor, I called him. He came out to my little church, and he said, what can I do for you? And I said, Mr. Mayor, our children don't have a swimming pool.
Yeah.
And he saw to it that the largest above ground swimming pool available was set up next to my church. So I said, we began to support him. So I saw that. I also had argued with him on the theoretical level. You know, seminarians and preachers in general are great at arguing theory.
Yeah, that's true.
Knowing the right thing to do, it doesn't mean they're out there really doing it so much, but I know I didn't. I can't say I was a great activist, but I will say that, my dad was doing some things, and I would argue theory with him, and I could pin his ears back on theory. It didn't occur to me that he was doing many of the things I wanted to see done, even though he definitely was a segregationist. So, there's all that mixed together, and I tried to take a lot of that into account, have a little mercy and grace maybe as years went by.
My guest today is Clyde Fant. He's the author of a memoir called The World in Black and White. we've been talking a lot about the book and about life in the South, and how he became active within more of a civil rights kind of movement. And one of the thoughts that I had, goes back to actually the introduction of the book, when you're talking to Stokely Carmichael and to Jefferson. I can't remember his last name, but you were talking to them about why you wanted to write this book, or your stories from the South, and they told you basically that you had to write this book. And can you talk about that a bit?
Jefferson Rogers was an early activist, pastor of a number of pretty significant churches, one in D.C., and he claims that Martin Luther King preached his first sermon outside of his own father's church, in his church, Jeff Rogers' church. And his wife was from Shreveport. And so naturally, when we get together, we would swap stories back and forth. And he told me I had to write them. Every time he saw me for 3 or 4 years, he would shake his long finger at me and he'd say, "Have you started writing that book yet?" And I'd say, "No." He'd say, "Well, why not? You better go on now, I'm telling you." And I didn't. But then he had a guest, and I knew him, his guest, only as a leader of a radical, I thought, black group. But I came to know him differently. And by that time, he was dressed in his Ghanaian robes, and we talked a bit, and Rogers insisted that I tell him some of my war stories from the early days, and I was embarrassed terribly. But when I finished, he stood and spread his arms with his robes like a great colorful bird and embraced me and said, "My brother." And I was overwhelmed. And from that moment on, I thought, well, and he told me, he said, "You've got to write them. Why haven't you written?" We knew there were white ministers out there doing something, but we don't know about that.
Yeah.
And I began writing.
Well, one of the thoughts that I had when I was reading the book too was that whenever the organization NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, or any number of other organizations were kind of mentioned in the South, that often those people were accused of communism. And one of the interesting things about the Black Lives Matter and many of the current protests that are going on in the country has been that they're called socialists, and that seems to be like a buzzword in the way that they try to label and dismiss people in that kind of a way. Do you have any thoughts as to like the current crisis and how it might relate to some of your experiences?
Yeah, it's racism. It's the same old racism. They can call it whatever they want to. You'd think they being opposed to socialism in the United States, for heaven's sakes, I expect them to oppose the fire departments next, because they are socialist. It's a socialist movement. I mean, after all, shouldn't we all just get out in our front yards with our hoses? What's the need for what is this one worldism? I mean, I get totally burned out listening to all these excuses. It is racism. You don't like blacks and others. You don't want them in our country. What plainer sign is there than a damn wall across the southern border, for heaven's sakes, to show that you don't want others? You don't want others coming in. You want to call a pandemic a Chinese pandemic. Everything is blamed on the others. It's pure, simple racism. And any young minister, young woman, young man that starts out these days might as well get ready for it. And if you think it is not in your church, you need to get out more.
Right.
You need to listen. And thank God it's not as bad. It is not as bad. If you think it is as bad, you weren't there. It's not as bad, but it is bad. And we need to be active about it.
I have always wondered, like Paul, when he writes in Galatians about there is neither slave nor free, um, Gentile or Jew, when all those male or female, when all those categories are kind of being put out there, how did people respond if you said black and white and there is neither black nor white? Would there have been a how would they have interpreted that at the time when you were preaching?
Well, probably if they were awake enough to even hear it, they probably would have just said, yes, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
But they would have thought of it in their own terms. Although I will say, in the church in Ruston, they would have heard it because they had pastors, at least a pastor prior to myself,
Right.
that said something about it.
Now he was an interesting figure because you didn't really go into great detail into what he actually wrote. But I saw the response was basically he lost his job. So what did he actually write in his letter or the theological concept he wrote?
He wrote the first pamphlet that ever went out, although I've never been able to locate even a copy of it. All those files have been buried by the current Southern Baptist Convention, I suppose. But he had written, as plain as anybody would write one today against segregation. And I'll tell you why. Avery Lee, he's a wonderful man, wonderful preacher. The trouble is, Avery didn't have boots on the ground. Many people, at least, use that excuse that Avery talked about it, but you never saw Avery among blacks, that he tended to be elitist, they thought. And they didn't like Avery for a number of reasons. But they used that as a reason to get rid of him.
Now, how did that, like, in some ways, the rest of the book, like after you get to Ruston, you talk a little bit about some of your relationships with like the Indian, the one that I remember was the Indian couple that moved into your neighborhood and the way that they embraced them. How do you like, are there other experiences like that kind of shaped your ministry there?
Well, that was certainly the most traumatic one, I guess. But it showed really the openness of many of our people, and they stayed in contact. Those Indian couple you mentioned were both getting master's degrees in physics, but they were black. Dark Indian from India, and so they were kicked out of their housing. Our ladies found very nice housing for them, and we remained very, very good friends. So those things spoke to me, and it indicated an openness, really, on the part of some people.
In the deacons meeting, I thought that was kind of interesting too. When you walk into a deacons meeting, it's all supposed to be about how you need to keep races separate and all that kind of thing. And then you stand up, you make a statement, and then it gets put into a committee, and then it gets brought back. Do you want to talk about the result of that? I mean, that was pretty profound. It actually showed a lot of leadership, I thought, in how you handled that.
Well, you know what? Sometimes anger, if you can direct it a bit, can help. We were talking about seating blacks, and we were all going to do it. And one man said, if they sit one of those SOBs next to my wife, I'll punch him in the jaw. And I just erupted. I stood up and said, I'll walk out. That'll be the end of all of this. And some of the people said, all right, we'll get a committee. And we did. And the committee voted unanimously to seat blacks. And it totally altered the landscape of the church.
Well, my guest today has been the Reverend Dr. Clyde Fant, a personal friend of mine, author of The World in Black and White, also the author of Worldly Preaching, The Misunderstood Jesus. It's one of my favorite little bits of homiletics a collection of homilies that he preached when he was at Stetson University. And then, I don't know, how many have you done with Mitchell Reddish about your travels through Turkey? Yeah, quite a few of them. But Clyde, I want to thank you for being on Encounter with me and for going through all the technical difficulties that accompany with all of this. I just need you to know that I appreciate you sticking with it and getting through. So I'm again, for all of you that are tuning in, I want to thank you for watching Encounter. I hope that you would be gentle and kind with each other as we go and approach this week, and that you would be patient and loving. Let's have a great week.